For 25 years, my family's organic farm had been our pride and joy, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and finally to me. We'd won state awards for our sustainable farming practices, and our produce fed hundreds of local families. But one morning I woke up to find HOA-hired workers ripping out our century-old heritage apple orchard, all because a newly formed suburban HOA suddenly decided our agricultural activities violated their aesthetic guidelines. The catch? We weren't even part of their association. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Michael Thompson, and our 12-acre River Valley farm has been my family's legacy since 1998. The property sits nestled in the heart of Riverside County, where the fertile soil and gentle slopes create perfect conditions for organic farming. When my grandfather first bought this land, it was nothing but untamed meadow and a few wild apple trees. Through decades of dedicated work, 3 generations of Thompsons transformed it into one of the most respected organic farms in the state. Took over the farm's operations from my father 10 years ago after spending 15 years learning every aspect of the business. It wasn't just about continuing the family legacy. It was about embracing innovation while honoring tradition. Under my stewardship, we transformed our traditional farming operation into a modern organic enterprise, but never at the expense of our core values. Our heritage apple orchard, with trees dating back to the 1940s, remained the crown jewel of our property, producing rare varieties you couldn't find anywhere else in the region. River Valley Farm wasn't just a business. It was the heart of our local community. Every week, hundreds of families relied on our organic produce. We ran a successful CSA program, supplying fresh vegetables and fruits to over 200 local households. Our farm stand, a charming wooden structure my father built with his own hands, had become a gathering place where neighbors caught up while picking out their weekly produce. The local schools brought students here for educational programs, teaching them about sustainable agriculture and the importance of knowing where their food comes from. My daughter Emma, who'd recently graduated from the State Agricultural College, had been breathing new life into our operations. She modernized our approach to community engagement, creating a strong social media presence that connected us with a younger generation of conscious consumers. Thanks to her efforts, we'd started hosting monthly workshops on organic gardening, composting, and sustainable living practices. The response had been overwhelming. People drove from 3 counties away to attend. What made our farm truly special was our heritage apple orchard. Those gnarled old trees, some of them nearly 80 years old, were living history. They produced varieties you couldn't find in any supermarket: the sweet-tart Newton Pippins, the rich-flavored Roxbury Russets, and the rare Arkansas Blacks that turned deep purple when ripe. We'd won several state preservation awards for maintaining these heirloom varieties, and agricultural students often visited to study these living examples of American farming heritage. The surrounding area had been changing rapidly over the past few years. What was once all farmland was gradually being transformed into suburban developments. We watched as neighboring farms sold their land to developers, replaced by cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. But our farm remained a green oasis, a reminder of the area's agricultural roots. While we adapted to having new neighbors, setting up sound barriers for our early morning operations and ensuring our organic pest control methods didn't drift onto their properties, we maintained our commitment to sustainable farming. Never imagined our farm's biggest challenge would come not from weather, pests, or market pressures, but from a group of people who'd moved into the area barely a year ago. People who seemed to think they could simply erase decades of agricultural heritage because it didn't fit their vision of suburban perfection. people who would soon show me just how far they'd go to impose their will on a family farm that had been feeding their community since before their development even existed. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to the warning signs. Maybe then I could have prevented what was about to happen. But who could have predicted that a homeowners association from a newly built subdivision would try to claim authority over an established family farm? Who would have thought they'd have the audacity to destroy part of our state's agricultural heritage without warning or right? What happened next would not only challenge everything we'd built, but would also spark a movement that would change how our entire region thought about preserving its agricultural heritage. This is the story of how our family farm faced its greatest threat and how a community came together to protect something worth saving. The morning that would change everything started like any other spring day at River Valley Farm. I woke before sunrise, as I had for the past decade, to the gentle chirping of birds nesting in our heritage apple trees. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet fragrance of apple blossoms that had just begun to open. These peaceful morning moments, before the world fully awakened, were what I treasured most about farm life. My morning routine was as familiar as breathing. First, a quick check of the weather station we'd installed last year, a modern addition Emma had insisted on to help us better predict frost risks for our sensitive apple blossoms. The digital display showed a perfect spring morning, 48 degrees with a gentle southeastern breeze, ideal conditions for the pollinating bees we'd be releasing later that week. Coffee in hand, I made my way to the greenhouse where our early season seedlings were thriving. The structure, a state-of-the-art design we'd invested in last fall, gleamed with morning dew. Inside, rows of organic tomato and pepper seedlings stretched toward the growing light, their leaves a vibrant green promise of the season ahead. I, who checked the automated watering system, another of Emma's modernizations, adjusting the settings for the warmer weather we'd been experiencing. Emma was already at work in the small office we'd set up in what used to be my grandfather's old tool shed. Through the window, I could see her updating our social media accounts, something that had become an essential part of our farm's success. She was sharing photos of yesterday's heritage apple tree grafting workshop, where we'd taught local gardeners how to preserve these rare varieties in their own yards. The post would probably go viral in our farming community groups. Emma had a talent for capturing the essence of what made our work special. Our first customers of the day were already arriving at the farm stand. Sarah Chen, a local restaurateur who'd been buying our produce for her farm-to-table restaurant for the past 5 years, was examining the early spring greens we'd harvested from the greenhouse. Her weekly orders had helped us weather the lean times, and her creative use of our heritage apples in her seasonal menus had helped spread awareness of these rare varieties. "The microgreens are exceptional this week, Michael," Sarah called out as I passed by. "And when will the first asparagus be ready? My customers have been asking." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself sharing her excitement about the coming harvest season. We discussed the upcoming crops, and I promised to let her know as soon as the asparagus started pushing through the soil. Meanwhile, our small team of farm workers was arriving. Maria, who'd been with us for 15 years, was already organizing the morning harvest with the efficiency of someone who knew every inch of our operation. Her daughter Anna, now in college studying agricultural science, was helping part-time, carrying on what had become a family tradition for both our families. The past morning sun was casting long shadows across the apple orchard as I made my way there for my daily inspection. These trees were more than just plants to me. Each one had its own story, its own character. The gnarly old Arkansas black near the fence line had survived 3 major storms and still produced the sweetest apples you'd ever taste. The row of Roxbury russets had been my father's pride and joy. He'd spent years nurturing them back to health after a particularly harsh winter nearly killed them. I walked among the trees, checking for any signs of disease or pest problems. Our organic management practices meant we had to be extra vigilant, catching any issues before they could spread. The morning dew made the spider webs between branches glisten like strands of silver, and the gentle buzzing of early bees filled the air. These moments, surrounded by the living history of our orchard, always reminded me of why we worked so hard to preserve these heritage varieties. Back at the main barn, Emma was setting up for the day's workshop. We'd been hosting more educational events lately, teaching everything from organic gardening basics to advanced grafting techniques. Today's session was about heritage seed saving, something that had become increasingly important as more people realized the value of preserving agricultural diversity. The barn, built by my grandfather and maintained meticulously over the years, had become a community gathering place, its weathered wooden walls witnessing the passing of agricultural knowledge from one generation to the next. As I helped Emma arrange chairs and prepare materials, we chatted about her latest ideas for the farm. She had plans to expand our educational programs, maybe partner with the local community college for some formal agricultural courses. Her enthusiasm reminded me of myself at her age, full of dreams about the farm's future. The morning sun streamed through the barn's windows, casting warm patches of light on the well-worn wooden floor, and I felt that familiar surge of pride in what our family had built here. Looking back now, I wish I could have frozen that morning in time. The peace, the purpose, the simple joy of working our land. If I'd known what was coming, maybe I would have savored those moments even more. But that's the thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves in advance. They just arrive, uninvited, and transform everything you thought you knew about your world. The first signs that something was amiss came during our heritage seed-saving workshop. I was demonstrating proper seed collection techniques to a group of enthusiastic gardeners when Maria quietly pulled me aside, her usual calm demeanor slightly shaken. "Michael, there are some people taking pictures of the orchard," she said, gesturing toward our eastern property line. "They've been there for almost an hour." I excused myself from the workshop, leaving Emma to continue the demonstration, and walked toward the area Maria had indicated. Sure enough, 3 people in business casual attire were standing just beyond our property marker, tablets in hand, pointing and discussing something while looking at our heritage apple orchard. As I approached, I noticed they had official-looking badges hanging from lanyards around their necks. The most concerning part wasn't just their presence. We'd grown used to people admiring our orchard, but their methodical approach. They were taking measurements, consulting documents, and making notes with the kind of attention that suggested more than casual interest. One woman was using a laser measuring device, carefully documenting distances between trees and our property line. "Can I help you folks with something?" I called out, trying to keep my tone friendly despite the unease growing in my stomach. The 3 of them exchanged glances before one man, wearing a polo shirt with a Meadowbrook Estates logo, stepped forward. "Just doing some preliminary survey work," he replied with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Nothing to worry about, but everything about their behavior suggested otherwise. The way they quickly packed up their equipment, how they avoided making eye contact, and their hurried departure all set off warning bells in my mind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that afternoon, while checking on the irrigation system near that same property line, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. New survey stakes had been placed along the edge of our orchard, marked with orange flags and bearing unfamiliar numbers. We hadn't authorized any surveying work, and no one had notified us about property assessments. I took photos of the stakes with my phone and called our family lawyer, Sarah Martinez. I'm sure it's nothing, I told her, trying to convince myself as much as her, but something doesn't feel right about this. Sarah promised to check with the county office about any planned assessments or zoning changes in our area. The next few days brought more subtle but troubling signs. A drone flew over our property multiple times, focusing particularly on the orchard area. Local real estate agents started driving by slowly, some even stopping to take pictures. When I approached one of them, she quickly drove away, leaving tire marks on our gravel road. During our weekly farmers market, I overheard snippets of conversation that added to my growing concern. Two customers were discussing how the new Meadowbrook Estates development was planning to expand their community footprint. Another mentioned something about improving the neighborhood aesthetics. These might have seemed like innocent comments, but combined with the recent unusual activities around our farm, they took on a more ominous tone. Emma noticed changes in our social media engagement too. Our farm's recent posts were receiving comments from newly created accounts, questioning whether agricultural activities belonged so close to residential areas. When she tried to engage with these commenters, asking for clarification, the accounts would either disappear or respond with vague references to community standards and property values. Even our regular customers picked up on the tension. Sarah Chen, while picking up her weekly produce order, mentioned that some of her restaurant customers had heard rumors about big changes coming to our area. They're saying the new development wants to create a more unified community appearance, she told me, concern evident in her voice, whatever that means. I tried to maintain my usual optimistic outlook, but these incidents were adding up to something that couldn't be ignored. During our family dinner that evening, I shared my concerns with Emma and Maria's family, who had joined us as they often did. Ina, Maria's daughter, mentioned that some of her college professors had been discussing cases of agricultural land being rezoned under pressure from residential developments. It's happening all over the state, Anna explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications. Small farms are being squeezed out by expanding suburbs. They usually start with subtle pressure. Complaints about early morning noise, concerns about organic pest control methods, questions about property aesthetics. That night I couldn't sleep. Standing on our back porch, looking out over the orchard my grandfather had planted, I felt a deep sense of foreboding. The moon cast long shadows through the apple trees, and for the first time these shadows seemed almost threatening, as if they were reaching toward us with a warning we couldn't quite understand. I called Sarah Martinez again the next morning, asking her to do a more thorough investigation into any recent property or zoning changes in our area. Something's coming, I told her, and I want to be prepared. Her response did little to ease my mind. I'll look into it right away, Michael. In my experience, when this many red flags appear at once, it's rarely a coincidence. The morning everything changed began with an unusual sound that cut through the pre-dawn silence, the low rumble of heavy machinery. At first, I dismissed it as construction noise from the Meadowbrook Estates development. We'd grown accustomed to the sounds of suburban expansion over the past year, but this was different. This was closer. Too close. I was in the greenhouse, checking on our tomato seedlings when Emma burst through the door, her face pale with panic. "Dad, they're here. They're at the orchard." Her voice cracked with emotion. "They have equipment. They're tearing out the trees." The words took a moment to register, seeming too absurd to be real, but Emma's expression told me this wasn't some horrible joke. I dropped the plant markers I was holding and ran. The sound of cracking wood and grinding machinery grew louder with each step. As I rounded the corner of the barn, the sight that met my eyes stopped me dead in my tracks. 3 large excavators were already at work in our heritage apple orchard. Their mechanical arms reached up, wrapping metal claws around the trunks of trees that had stood for nearly 8 decades. With sickening efficiency, they yanked these living pieces of history from the ground, roots and all. Behind them, a line of dump trucks waited to haul away what remained of our family's legacy. The first tree I saw fall was our prized Arkansas black, the one that had survived 3 major storms. Its branches were still heavy with spring blossoms as it crashed to the ground, petals scattered in the air like snow, a beautiful tragedy unfolding in slow motion. This tree had been my grandfather's favorite, the one he'd nursed back to health after the drought of '62. Now it lay broken and uprooted, its decades of history destroyed in seconds. Workers in yellow safety vests moved methodically behind the machines, clearing smaller branches and preparing the next section for destruction. The morning sun, just beginning to rise, cast long shadows through the devastation, creating a nightmarish scene of twisted shadows and falling blossoms. The air was thick with the smell of broken wood and disturbed earth, mixed with the acrid diesel exhaust from the machinery. I watched in horror as they approached the section where we kept our rarest varieties, trees that produced apples you couldn't find anywhere else in the state. Some of these varieties were so rare that we'd been working with agricultural preservation societies to protect them. Each tree contained genetic material that had been carefully preserved through generations of farming families. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with emotion as I ran toward the nearest excavator. "You can't do this. These trees are protected." But the machines didn't slow. If anything, they seemed to move faster, as if racing to destroy as much as possible before someone could stop them. Emma had already pulled out her phone and was live streaming the destruction on our farm's social media accounts, her hands shaking as she documented the carnage. "They're destroying historic apple varieties," she narrated, her voice breaking. "Some of these trees are the last of their kind in our region." Maria and her family, arriving for their usual morning work, stood frozen at the edge of the orchard. Anna, who had spent countless hours helping us document these heritage varieties for her college research, began to cry. These trees weren't just part of our farm. They were part of her education, her future research, her connection to agricultural history. Sarah Chen pulled up in her restaurant van, presumably for her regular morning pickup, and immediately jumped out, phone in hand. "I'm calling everyone I know," she shouted over the noise of the machinery. "This is insane. They can't just destroy protected agricultural heritage." Through the chaos, I noticed a group of people standing off to the side, watching the destruction with clinical detachment. They were dressed in business attire, completely out of place among the mud and fallen trees. One woman, perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, was checking items off on a tablet, nodding with satisfaction as each tree fell. The contrast was jarring, these clean, pressed suits among the destruction of something that had taken generations to build. They represented everything that was wrong with this situation. The prioritization of suburban aesthetics over agricultural heritage, the casual destruction of history in the name of progress. A particularly loud crack drew my attention back to the destruction. The excavators had reached the center of our orchard, where our oldest trees grew. These trees were living archives, their genetics unchanged since the pioneer days. Each one lost represented not just the death of a tree, but the extinction of a unique piece of agricultural history. I felt something break inside me as I watched another ancient tree crash to the ground. This wasn't just an attack on our farm. It was an assault on everything we stood for: sustainable agriculture, historical preservation, community education, and the right to maintain agricultural land that had been in production for generations. The very foundation of our family's legacy was being ripped away, quite literally by the roots, and I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. Finding my voice through the shock and horror, I started running toward the group in business attire, waving my arms above my head. "Stop this right now!" I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the roar of machinery. "This is private property. You have no right to be here." The woman with the tablet looked up, her expression a practiced mask of professional indifference. She held up her hand, and to my surprise, the nearest excavator operator actually paused. The sudden quiet felt almost as jarring as the chaos had been, broken only by the sound of settling debris and the gentle patter of falling apple blossoms. "Mr. Thompson, I presume," she said, stepping forward with an air of authority that made my blood boil. "I'm Patricia Reynolds, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We're conducting a necessary aesthetic improvement operation as per our community guidelines." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. The casual way she described the destruction of our heritage orchard as an aesthetic improvement operation made me want to scream. Instead, I forced myself to take a deep breath before responding. "This is private property," I repeated, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "We're not part of your HOA. You have no authority here." Patricia gave me what I can only describe as a condescending smile, the kind you might give a child who doesn't understand basic arithmetic. "Actually, Mr. Thompson, as of last month, your property falls within our expanded jurisdiction. The Community Enhancement Clause in our bylaws gives us full authority to address any aesthetic inconsistencies within our boundaries." Emma had moved closer, her phone still recording everything. "That's impossible," she interjected. "We never received any notification. We never agreed to join your HOA. You can't just claim jurisdiction over private agricultural land." Patricia's smile didn't waver as she pulled out a stack of papers from her leather portfolio. "Everything is perfectly legal, I assure you. The annexation was approved by our board and properly filed. Your agricultural activities—" She paused, wrinkling her nose slightly, as if the very word left a bad taste in her mouth, "are in direct violation of our community standards." I grabbed the papers she held out, scanning them quickly. The documents were filled with legal jargon and references to suburban development codes. But what caught my eye was the date. They'd filed these papers just 3 weeks ago without any notification to us. "This is fraud," I said, my voice rising. "You can't retroactively claim authority over established agricultural land. These trees are part of a state-recognized heritage preservation program." I pulled out my phone, showing her the certificates and documentation we'd received from the State Agricultural Board. "Some of these varieties are irreplaceable." Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Thompson, the time for discussion was during the community feedback period. If you failed to attend our meetings or respond to our notices, that's hardly our responsibility. The decision has been made, and this operation will continue." By now, Sarah Chen had gotten through to someone on her phone. She rushed over, excitement in her voice. "Michael, I've got the State Agricultural Preservation Office on the line. They want to talk to whoever's in charge here." For the first time, I saw Patricia's confident facade crack slightly. She glanced at her watch, then at the partially destroyed orchard, clearly calculating something in her head. Before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "Those notices you mentioned," Maria called out, stepping forward. "Would those be the certified letters that were supposed to be sent to all affected property owners?" Her voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "Because I handle all the farm's mail, and we never received any such notices." Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Our records indicate all required notifications were sent," she said. But there was a new uncertainty in her tone. "Then you'll have proof of delivery," Emma chimed in, her phone still recording. "Tracking numbers, signed receipts. I'm sure the UE, State Agricultural Board, would be very interested in seeing those, especially given the protected status of these trees." The confrontation was drawing attention. Several cars had stopped along the road, and people were gathering to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. I could see Patricia growing increasingly uncomfortable with the audience. "This is a private HOA matter," she announced, raising her voice to address the growing crowd. "I'm going to have to ask everyone who doesn't live in Meadowbrook Estates to leave the area immediately." "Private matter?" I laughed incredulously. "You're destroying a piece of our state's agricultural heritage. These trees are part of a public preservation program. There's nothing private about this." Patricia turned to one of her associates, muttering something under her breath. The man nodded and pulled out his phone, stepping away to make a call. Meanwhile, more people were arriving. I recognized several faces from our farmers' market, local restaurant owners who bought our produce, and even a few teachers who had brought their classes to our educational programs. The weight of public attention was clearly affecting Patricia's confidence. The carefully constructed facade of authority was crumbling in the face of community opposition, and the growing realization that this might not be the simple operation she had planned. But I could also see determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to back down easily, even as the situation spiraled beyond her control. While the confrontation with Patricia Reynolds continued, I knew we needed official intervention immediately. Emma had already called 911, but I decided to take additional action. With trembling fingers, I dialed Sarah Martinez, our lawyer, putting her on speakerphone so everyone could hear. "Sarah, they're destroying the orchard right now," I said, my voice cracking. "Some HOA from the new development claims they have jurisdiction. They're tearing out our heritage trees." Sarah's response was immediate and forceful. "Don't let them remove anything from the property, Michael. I'm calling Judge Anderson right now for an emergency injunction. Document everything. Photos, videos, names, company logos on the equipment, everything." As if on cue, we heard sirens in the distance. Patricia's composed expression flickered briefly, but she quickly recovered, pulling out another document from her portfolio. "The police can't stop a legally authorized HOA action," she stated, though her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the scene, lights flashing. Deputy Tom Wilson, who'd known our family for years, stepped out first, followed by his partner. The deputy took one look at the destruction, and his face hardened. He'd brought his own children to our apple-picking events every fall. "What's going on here?" he demanded, taking in the scene of devastation. Before Patricia could speak, I handed him the state agricultural preservation certificates and explained the situation. Emma's phone was still recording, capturing every word of the exchange. "Ma'am," Deputy Wilson addressed Patricia, "I'm going to need to see permits for this operation. Tree removal on protected agricultural land requires county approval." His tone was professional but firm. Patricia produced her stack of HOA documents again, but the deputy wasn't impressed. "These are HOA bylaws, not county permits," he stated, "and I'm not seeing any evidence of proper notification or judicial approval for annexation of agricultural land." While this exchange was happening, Sarah Martinez's voice came through my phone speaker. "Michael, Judge Anderson is reviewing the emergency injunction request right now. Keep the line open. She wants to hear what's happening in real time." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Local news vans were starting to arrive, drawn by social media alerts and calls from concerned citizens. Sarah Chen had managed to get through to the State Agricultural Preservation Office, and they were sending representatives immediately. "Deputy," Patricia interjected, "this is a civil matter between the HOA and a property owner. Your jurisdiction here is limited." She was trying to maintain control, but her voice betrayed her growing concern. "Actually," Deputy Wilson replied, "the destruction of state-protected agricultural resources falls under criminal statutes. Until you can produce valid permits and proof of proper annexation procedures, this operation needs to stop immediately." As if to underscore his point, a new voice cut through the tension. "This is Judge Anderson," came the authoritative voice from my phone speaker. "I'm issuing an immediate emergency injunction. All demolition activities must cease pending a full hearing." Any continuation will be considered contempt of court. The effect was immediate. The excavator operators, who had been watching the exchange nervously, started shutting down their machines. Patricia's face had gone pale, and she was now frantically texting someone on her phone. Furthermore, Judge Anderson continued, her voice clear in the sudden quiet, no materials are to be removed from the property. Everything, including damaged trees and equipment, must remain in place for documentation and assessment. Deputy Wilson nodded to his partner, who began taking photos of the scene and equipment for official documentation. "Ma'am," he addressed, "Patricia, I need to see identification from everyone involved in this operation, including all equipment operators and supervisors." The crowd had grown even larger, and news cameras were rolling. Local reporters were already doing live broadcasts from the scene, highlighting the destruction of historic apple varieties and the community's response. Several agricultural professors from the state university, alerted by Anna's college contacts, had arrived and were documenting the damage to the heritage trees. Patricia attempted one last show of authority. "This is an overreaction to a simple community improvement project. The HOA has clear rights to—" "The HOA has no rights here," Sarah Martinez's voice cut through, sharp and clear on the phone. "I've reviewed your supposed annexation documents. They lack basic legal requirements, including proper notification, county approval, and agricultural zoning considerations. Every minute these trees continue to be destroyed increases your liability." The situation had shifted dramatically. What had started as a unilateral action by the HOA had transformed into a multi-agency response. State agricultural officials were en route, environmental crime investigators had been notified, and the media was ensuring every detail was being broadcast live. Throughout all this, Emma had continued documenting everything, her live stream now being watched by thousands. The community's response was overwhelming. Local farmers, environmental activists, and preservation societies were all pledging support and resources for the legal battle ahead. Looking at the partially destroyed orchard, my heart ached for the lost trees, but I felt a glimmer of hope. The cavalry had arrived, and it was clear this wouldn't be the simple land grab the HOA had planned. The question now was, how much of our heritage could we save, and how would we hold them accountable for what they'd already destroyed? The next morning, as the sun rose over our damaged orchard, I began the painful process of documenting every lost tree. The destruction looked even worse in the clear morning light. Emma walked beside me, her camera clicking constantly as we catalogued the devastation. Each fallen tree represented not just a physical loss, but generations of agricultural history erased in moments. Sarah Martinez arrived early, armed with a thick folder of legal documents and accompanied by an agricultural assessment expert she'd brought in from the state capitol. "We need to build an airtight case," she explained, spreading papers across our kitchen table. The HOA's actions weren't just illegal, they were calculated and deliberate. The expert, Dr. James Morrison from the State Agricultural Preservation Board, walked the orchard with us, his face growing increasingly grave as he documented each destroyed specimen. "Some of these varieties are irreplaceable," he explained, kneeling beside a twisted trunk. "This one here, it's a Gravenstein apple that's been verified to be a direct descendant of the original European stock. There are maybe 5 such trees left in the entire country. While we worked, Maria and Anna helped compile our farm's historical records. Years of documentation, awards, certificates, and participation in state preservation programs. Everything that proved our orchard's significance. Anna's college research papers on our heritage varieties added another layer of scientific validation to our case." "Look at this," Anna called out, pulling up an email on her laptop. 3 months ago, the State Agricultural Board renewed our heritage site status. The HOA would have found this in any basic property records search. They knew exactly what they were destroying. Sarah Chen arrived with coffee and pastries for everyone, but also with valuable information. "My customers have been talking," she said. "Apparently Meadowbrook Estates has been planning this for months. They've been telling potential home buyers about their plans for a community enhancement project in this area. They were selling houses based on promises of expanding their development before they even made any legal moves against your farm." The investigation took an interesting turn when Emma started digging through our social media history. "Dad, look at this," she said, pulling up our farm's social media feed. "Remember those negative comments we started getting? I traced some of them back. They're all connected to accounts created by a marketing firm hired by Meadowbrook Estates. They were trying to build a negative narrative about our farm months before this happened. Our lawyer was particularly interested in this discovery." "This shows premeditation," Sarah Martinez explained, adding the social media evidence to her growing file. "They weren't just being careless about proper procedures. They were actively working to undermine your farm's reputation to justify their actions." Around midday, we received an unexpected visit from County Clerk Robert Henderson. He looked troubled as he spread out property maps and zoning documents across our table. "I've been reviewing all property transactions and zoning changes in this area for the past year," he explained. "What I'm finding is concerning. The HOA's claimed jurisdiction expansion wasn't just improperly filed. It appears they deliberately bypassed required agricultural zoning reviews." He showed us a series of documents pointing out discrepancies and missing approvals. "See these dates. They filed their expansion plans during the holiday week when they knew the Agricultural Review Board wouldn't be in session. Then they rushed the paperwork through using emergency urban development provisions that shouldn't apply to agricultural land. The more we dug, the more irregularities we found. Dr. Morrison discovered that the HOA had never filed for the required environmental impact studies before removing heritage trees. The County Agricultural Commissioner's Office had no record of the required notifications for changes to protected agricultural land use. They weren't just cutting corners, Sarah Martinez concluded, reviewing all the evidence we'd gathered. This was a systematic attempt to circumvent every protection in place for agricultural heritage land. They were counting on moving so fast that no one could stop them before it was too late. Emma, who had been quietly working on her laptop, suddenly called everyone over. "You need to see this," she said, pulling up a real estate listing. It was for a house in Meadowbrook Estates posted 3 months ago. In the property description, it mentioned upcoming community enhancements and included a computer-rendered image of a planned park, right where our orchard stood. They were selling houses using plans that showed our property as part of their development, Emma explained, her voice shaking with anger. They were marketing this before they even filed any paperwork. They were literally selling something they didn't own and had no legal right to take. The evidence was damning, but it also revealed the scope of what we were up against. This wasn't just a simple case of HOA overreach. It was a calculated plan to seize and develop protected agricultural land, orchestrated by people who knew exactly what they were doing and thought they could get away with it. As the day progressed, more community members stopped by, bringing their own pieces to the puzzle. A former Meadowbrook Estates board member, speaking anonymously, revealed that Patricia Reynolds had personally pushed for aggressive expansion, promising residents that their property values would soar once the agricultural nuisance was removed. Armed with the evidence we'd gathered, I decided it was time to confront the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board directly. Sarah Martinez advised against going alone, so Emma and Dr. Morrison accompanied me to the HOA's monthly meeting, which was being held in their newly built community center, a stark contrast to our farm's weathered barn. The building itself, seemed to embody everything wrong with their approach, all gleaming surfaces and artificial perfection without a speck of character or history. As we walked through the automatic glass doors, I couldn't help but think about how many heritage trees could have been preserved with the money spent on this monument to suburban conformity. Inside, the meeting room was packed. Word had spread about our intended appearance, and it seemed like half the development had shown up. Patricia Reynolds sat at the center of a long table at the front, flanked by other board members. Her composed expression flickered slightly. When she saw us enter with Dr. Morrison in his official State Agricultural Board blazer, Mr. Thompson, she acknowledged curtly as we took seats in the front row. "This is a private HOA meeting. I'm not sure you have standing to—" "Actually," Sarah Martinez interrupted, striding in behind us with her briefcase, "according to your own claimed annexation, you've made Mr. Thompson a member of this HOA. Therefore, he has every right to be here and address the board." Patricia's face tightened, but she couldn't argue with her own logic. "Very well. You'll have 3 minutes during the public comment period." "I think," Sarah continued, "given the gravity of recent events and the presence of state officials, this matter deserves more than 3 minutes." She placed a thick folder on the table, especially considering the evidence of fraudulent property claims and destruction of protected agricultural resources. The room erupted in murmurs. Many residents were learning for the first time about the full scope of what their HOA had done. Emma set up her laptop, connecting to the room's projector system before anyone could object. "Let me show everyone exactly what happened," she said, her voice steady as she pulled up the footage from that morning. The room fell silent as images of the destruction filled the screen. The sound of ancient trees being ripped from the earth echoed through the premium sound system. Dr. Morrison stepped forward. "Those trees weren't just old plants," he explained to the stunned audience. "They were living history, part of our state's agricultural heritage preservation program. Some varieties were irreplaceable, their genetics unique and vital for biodiversity." A woman in the audience stood up. "Ms. Reynolds, you told us this was unused land that would be converted into a community park. You never mentioned destroying protected trees," another resident joined in. "We were promised community enhancement, not the destruction of historic property. Are HOA fees paid for this? We could be liable." Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting. The board acted within its authority to improve property values and community aesthetics. The Thompson farm was an eyesore that— An eyesore? I couldn't contain myself any longer. That eyesore fed hundreds of local families. Those trees were part of university research programs. School children learned about agriculture and history in that orchard. Your aesthetic improvements destroyed something irreplaceable. Emma switched her presentation to show the marketing materials we'd discovered. The HOA was selling houses using plans that showed our property as their development before any legal proceedings. They knew the land was protected. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but they did it anyway. The room erupted again, but this time the anger was directed at the board. Residents were shouting questions about legal liability and property values. One man was waving his phone, showing he was already getting calls from worried mortgage lenders. "That's enough!" Patricia slammed her hand on the table. "This meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene at a later date to—" "You can't adjourn yet," Sarah Martinez cut in. "According to your own bylaws, when a motion is on the floor, which I'm making now, it must be heard. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board and the appointment of an interim board, pending full investigation of these actions." The parliamentary procedure caught Patricia off guard. She looked to the HOA's lawyer, who was frantically flipping through their bylaws. But it was too late. Residents were already calling for the vote, angry about being misled and worried about their own liability. What happened next was a clear reminder that no matter how much power HOA boards think they have, they still answer to their members. The vote wasn't even close. Patricia Reynolds and her entire board were removed, pending a full investigation of their actions. An interim board was appointed on the spot, including several residents who had opposed the aggressive expansion plans from the start. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, with former board members hurrying out and residents clustering in angry discussion groups, Emma turned to me with a small smile. "Dad, I think we just witnessed the shortest HOA presidency in history." The day after the HOA board meeting, Sarah Martinez set up a command center in our barn, transforming the space where we usually held educational workshops into a legal war room. Folding tables were covered with documents, laptops hummed with activity, and the walls were plastered with maps, timelines, and photographs documenting the destruction. "We're not just filing a simple property damage lawsuit," Sarah explained, spreading out a new set of documents. "We're building a multi-pronged legal strategy." She pointed to different sections of her brief. "First, we're pursuing criminal charges for the destruction of protected agricultural resources. Second, we're filing civil suits for damages against both the HOA and individual board members. Third, we're seeking injunctive relief to prevent any future attempts at land grabbing." Dr. Morrison had brought in additional experts from the State Agricultural Preservation Board. They moved methodically through the destroyed section of the orchard, documenting every lost tree with scientific precision. "Each of these trees has a monetary value," explained Dr. Morrison, "but they also have incalculable scientific and historical worth. We are preparing expert testimony on the impact this destruction has on agricultural biodiversity." Emma worked with Anna to compile years of research data about our heritage varieties. "Look at this," Anna said, pulling up her college research papers. "We can prove that some of these trees were part of ongoing university studies. The HOA didn't just destroy private property, they interfered with active scientific research. The legal team grew as other organizations joined our cause. The State Environmental Protection Office sent representatives concerned about the precedent this could set for protected agricultural lands. The Historic Preservation Society became involved after learning about the age and significance of our orchard. Even the local Native American tribe sent their legal counsel, as some of our apple varieties had historical connections to their traditional foodways. "What the HOA did here threatens more than just your farm," explained Richard, Standing Bear, the tribal legal representative. "It threatens our ability to preserve historical agricultural practices and protect culturally significant plants. We're filing an amicus brief in support of your case." Sarah Chen arrived with an unexpected contribution: statements from dozens of local restaurants and food businesses that relied on our heritage apples. "This isn't just about losing trees," she explained. "It's about the economic impact on our entire local food system. These businesses built their products and reputations around these unique varieties. The support was overwhelming, but so was the scope of what we faced. Every expert who examined the situation found new layers of legal violations and environmental impacts. The technical reports were stacking up: soil analysis showing disruption to the local ecosystem, economic impact studies demonstrating the ripple effects through the local agriculture sector, historical documentation establishing the irreplaceable nature of what was lost. "The challenge," Sarah Martinez explained during a strategy session, "is making sure the court understands the full scope of the damage. This isn't like someone cutting down their neighbor's decorative tree, where you can calculate replacement cost. These trees were living history, part of active research, central to local agriculture, and irreplaceable genetic resources. Local law students volunteered to help with research, digging through decades of agricultural protection laws and land use regulations. They uncovered previous cases where HOAs had attempted similar land grabs, building a pattern that would help establish the systemic nature of the threat to agricultural lands. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. A former employee of the development company behind Meadowbrook Estates came forward with internal emails discussing the planned annexation of our farm. The emails, dated months before any official action, showed that the developers knew about the protected status of our trees but proceeded anyway, calculating that the potential profits would outweigh any legal penalties. "This is the smoking gun," Sarah said, reviewing the emails. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it was illegal. They just didn't care because they thought they could get away with it. Maria, who had been quietly supporting our efforts while keeping the remaining farm operations running, made a crucial observation. "Look at the dates on these documents," she said, pointing to the HOA's filed paperwork. They submitted their annexation claims during the harvest season, when they knew farmers would be too busy to attend town meetings or notice legal postings. The evidence of calculation and manipulation was staggering. What had at first appeared to be simple HOA overreach was revealing itself as a carefully orchestrated attempt to seize protected agricultural land, coordinated between developers, HOA board members, and various business interests. As our legal team worked late into the night, the barn that had hosted generations of farmers now housed a different kind of cultivation. The growth of a legal case that would not only seek justice for our farm, but potentially change how agricultural land was protected from development throughout the state. As our legal battle gained momentum, we discovered we weren't alone in our fight against aggressive HOA expansion. The media coverage of our story had struck a chord, and suddenly my email inbox was flooded with messages from other farmers and landowners who'd faced similar threats. One message particularly caught my attention. It was from David Martinez, no relation to our lawyer Sarah, who owned a third-generation family vineyard about 50 miles north. "The same thing almost happened to us," he wrote. "Meadowbrook Development Group, the company behind your HOA, who tried to annex our land last year through a different HOA they created. We only stopped them because we accidentally discovered their plans early." Sarah Martinez immediately arranged a meeting with David at our farm. He arrived carrying boxes of documents that detailed his own battle. "They used the exact same playbook," he explained, spreading papers across our kitchen table. "First came the surveys, then mysterious property stakes appeared. They even used the same language about community enhancement in their documents. Emma, who had been documenting everything, noticed something striking. "Look at these dates," she said, comparing David's paperwork with ours. "They targeted his vineyard right after the harvest season too, just like they did with us. This wasn't coincidence. This was their strategy." David's story revealed a pattern we hadn't seen before. "After they failed with us, they apparently moved on to your area," he explained. "But here's what's really interesting. I've been doing some digging. Meadowbrook Development Group has created at least 6 different HOAs in 3 counties, always near agricultural properties. They use the HOAs as tools to expand their developments onto farmland." Our lawyer was particularly interested in this connection. "This changes everything," Sarah said, reviewing David's documents. "We're not just dealing with one overzealous HOA board. This is a systematic attempt by a development company to use HOAs as weapons against agricultural properties." More allies emerged as word spread. Clara Chen, Sarah Chen's cousin who worked at the county records office, discovered something crucial. "I've been tracking Meadowbrook's property acquisitions," she explained during an emergency meeting. "They create these HOAs, but they always retain majority voting rights through subsidiary companies. The resident homeowners are just pawns in their larger land grab scheme." The pattern became clearer as more people came forward. James Wilson, a retired farmer from the next county, shared how he'd lost part of his apple orchard to a similar scheme 2 years ago. "I didn't have the resources to fight them," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "They wore me down with legal threats until I gave in. Don't let them do that to you." Emma took charge of coordinating with these new allies, creating a digital database of their experiences and evidence. "Each case adds another piece to the puzzle," she explained during a strategy session. "We're seeing how they refined their tactics over time, learning from each attempt what worked best to pressure farmers into giving up their land. One particularly valuable ally emerged from an unexpected quarter. Marcus Reynolds, Patricia's own nephew and a junior partner at her law firm, reached out secretly through Sarah Martinez. "I can't be publicly involved," he explained in a secure meeting away from the farm, "but I've seen their playbook from the inside. They specifically target farms with historical or environmental protections, believing the owners won't have the resources to fight back." Marcus provided crucial insights into their legal strategy. "They count on farmers being land-rich but cash-poor," he revealed. "They know most can't afford prolonged legal battles. They also time their moves carefully, often during harvest seasons, or key agricultural periods when farmers are most vulnerable and distracted." The support network grew beyond just other farmers. Environmental groups, seeing the broader threat to protected lands, offered their resources. The State Historical Society, concerned about the loss of agricultural heritage, pledged their support. Even urban food justice organizations got involved, recognizing how the loss of heritage farms affected food security and cultural preservation. A breakthrough came when we connected with the River Valley Agricultural Preservation Alliance, a coalition of small farmers and landowners who had been tracking similar cases across the state. Their president, Eleanor Martinez, again no relation to Sarah, had been building a case against predatory development practices for years. "What happened to your farm isn't an isolated incident," Eleanor explained during a coalition meeting in our barn. "It's part of a larger pattern of using HOAs to bypass agricultural zoning protections. We've documented dozens of cases, but yours is the first with such clear evidence of their tactics." The Alliance brought resources we desperately needed: legal expertise, scientific documentation, and most importantly, a network of supporters who understood exactly what we were fighting for. They helped us understand that our battle wasn't just about saving our farm. It was about protecting agricultural heritage across the entire region. As our network of allies grew, so did our understanding of what we were really fighting against. This wasn't just about one HOA's overreach or even one development company's greed. We were uncovering a systematic assault on agricultural lands, disguised as suburban development and hidden behind the seemingly benign facade of homeowners associations. With our growing network of allies and mounting evidence, we realized we needed to organize our efforts more formally. Emma suggested hosting a community meeting at our farm to bring everyone together. "We need to coordinate our resources," she explained. "There's strength in numbers, but only if we're working together." The response exceeded our expectations. On a crisp Saturday morning, over 200 people gathered in our barn: farmers, environmental activists, legal experts, and concerned citizens. The space that had hosted countless agricultural workshops was now becoming the birthplace of a movement. Sarah Martinez opened the meeting with a sobering assessment. "What we're facing isn't just about one farm or one HOA," she explained, standing before maps showing targeted agricultural properties across 3 counties. "This is a coordinated assault on protected farmland, disguised as suburban development. But today, we start fighting back." David Martinez shared his vineyard story first, followed by James Wilson's account of losing his orchard. Each testimony revealed similar patterns, building a compelling picture of systematic land grabbing. Clara Chen, presented her findings from county records, showing how Meadowbrook Development Group had created a web of HOAs to facilitate their expansion. "They're not just building houses," Clara explained, pointing to complex ownership diagrams. "They're creating tools for land acquisition. These HOAs are designed to fail at actual community management. Their real purpose is to serve as legal vehicles for seizing adjacent properties." Eleanor from the Agricultural Preservation Alliance presented data showing the broader impact. "In the last 5 years, our region has lost over 5,000 acres of protected agricultural land to similar schemes," she revealed. "That's not just about property, it's about food security, environmental stability, and our cultural heritage." The meeting took an unexpected turn when Marcus Reynolds, still maintaining his anonymity, called in to share his insights. Through a disguised voice, he detailed the legal strategies used by development companies. "They count on overwhelming small farmers with legal costs," he explained. "They know most farms operate on tight margins and can't afford prolonged court battles." As the scope of the threat became clear, people began offering resources. Local restaurants led by Sarah Chen pledged to create a legal defense fund. Environmental groups offered their research teams. Even some Meadowbrook Estates residents, horrified by what their HOA had done, volunteered to help. Dr. Morrison presented a comprehensive plan for documenting agricultural heritage sites. "We need to create an unassailable record of these properties. Historical and scientific value," he explained. "Make it harder for developers to dismiss them as just unused land." Ina, speaking from her perspective as an agricultural science student, proposed creating a youth advocacy group. "We need to engage the next generation," she urged. "This isn't just about saving current farms, it's about protecting agricultural heritage for the future." The energy in the room was electric as people formed working groups based on their expertise. Legal teams coordinated with environmental researchers. Marketing professionals planned public awareness campaigns. Farmers shared strategies for protecting their lands from similar threats. Maria suggested creating an early warning system. "We need to alert each other when we see signs of these tactics," she explained. "Property surveys, mysterious stakes, sudden HOA expansion plans. Anything suspicious should be reported immediately." Emma took charge of digital coordination, setting up secure communication channels and databases. "We need to document everything," she insisted. "Every incident, every pattern, every piece of evidence. Build a case so strong they can't ignore it." The coalition that emerged from that meeting was unlike anything our region had seen before. We called it the Heritage Agricultural Protection Alliance, HAPA, a name that reflected both our respect for farming tradition and our commitment to future preservation. Working groups were established, each with clear objectives. The legal defense team, led by Sarah Martinez, would coordinate our court battles and help other farmers protect their rights. The documentation group, headed by Dr. Morrison, would create comprehensive records of agricultural heritage sites. The community response network, coordinated by Maria, would monitor development activities and alert farmers to potential threats. The Public Education Committee, led by Emma and Anna, would raise awareness about the importance of protecting agricultural land. The Economic Impact Team, organized by Sarah Chen, would demonstrate the vital role of heritage farms in local economies. Richard Standing Bear, speaking for the Tribal Council, offered a powerful perspective. "This land holds stories older than any of our current laws," he reminded us. "When we protect these farms, we're not just saving property, we're preserving living history." As the meeting concluded, people lingered, exchanging contact information and making plans. The barn that had witnessed generations of agricultural tradition was now witnessing the birth of a movement dedicated to protecting that very heritage. Before everyone left, I stood up to share one final thought. What happened to our orchard was tragic, I said, looking at the faces of my new allies. But maybe it had to happen to wake us up to the bigger threat. Today, we stop reacting and start preventing. Today, we start fighting back. The media coverage of our story exploded in ways we never expected. What started as local news coverage of an HOA dispute transformed into a national conversation about the preservation of agricultural heritage and the rights of family farms. Emma's social media documentation had gone viral, catching the attention of major news networks. The morning after our coalition meeting, I woke up to find national news vans parked along our driveway. Reporters walked carefully through our damaged orchard, their cameras capturing the destruction of centuries-old trees. The contrast between the surviving section of our heritage orchard and the devastated area created a powerful visual that seemed to resonate with viewers across the country. This isn't just about trees, I explained to a reporter from a major network, standing among the fallen apple blossoms. These were living archives of agricultural history. Some of these varieties existed nowhere else in the world. Imagine burning down a library of irreplaceable books. That's essentially what happened here. Dr. Morrison's presence lent scientific credibility to our story. He explained to journalists how these heritage varieties contributed to genetic diversity and food security. In an era of climate change and increasing pest pressures, he stated, these old varieties could hold crucial genetic traits for developing resilient future crops. Their loss is incalculable. Environmental groups seized on our story as a perfect example of what they'd been warning about for years. This is what happens when we prioritize suburban sprawl over agricultural heritage, explained Diana Chen, director of the State Environmental Protection Alliance. Once these genetic resources are lost, they're gone forever. Sarah Chen organized a chef's protest that caught media attention. Dozens of local restaurant owners set up cooking stations along the road near our farm, preparing dishes that featured our heritage apples. These unique varieties aren't just about history, she told reporters while cooking. They're about flavor, about cultural heritage, about keeping our food system diverse and resilient. The coverage took an unexpected turn when investigative journalists began digging into Meadowbrook Development Group's history. They uncovered a pattern of similar actions across multiple states, always using HOAs as tools for land acquisition. One reporter found that the company had specifically targeted properties with historical or environmental protections, believing they could overwhelm small landowners with legal pressure. Emma's social media campaign gained momentum as more people shared their own stories of HOA overreach and agricultural land loss. Our farm's hashtag, #SaveHeritageFarms, became a rallying cry for agricultural preservation nationwide. Her live streams of our daily farm activities, contrasting the peaceful surviving sections with the destroyed areas, drew millions of views. The public response was overwhelming. Letters and emails poured in from across the country. Farmers shared similar stories of development pressure. Agricultural students offered to help document our remaining heritage varieties. Even urban dwellers expressed outrage at the loss of agricultural heritage they hadn't known existed. Local schools began organizing field trips to our farm, turning our story into an educational opportunity. Teachers used our case to discuss environmental preservation, local history, and civic responsibility. The sight of children learning about heritage agriculture among our surviving trees, while looking at the destruction nearby, created powerful images that further fueled public support. Richard Standing Bear's involvement brought another dimension to the media coverage. These trees were here before any of our modern property laws, he explained to reporters. They're part of our region's original food system. Their destruction isn't just about property rights, it's about erasing living history. The media attention brought unexpected allies. Celebrity chefs who had featured our heritage apples in their restaurants spoke out. Environmental activists organized peaceful protests at Meadowbrook Development Group's offices. Even some suburban developers came forward, distancing themselves from what they called predatory development practices. National agricultural preservation societies began using our case as an example in their advocacy work. What happened at River Valley Farm represents a larger threat to American agricultural heritage, explained Dr. James Wilson from the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation. If this can happen to a state-recognized heritage site, no agricultural land is safe. The pressure began affecting Meadowbrook Development Group's business. Potential home buyers, now aware of their tactics, started backing out of contracts. Other communities began scrutinizing their development proposals more carefully. Their stock price took a hit as investors questioned their practices. Perhaps most significantly, our story sparked a broader conversation about the relationship between suburban development and agricultural preservation. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers discussing the need for better protections for heritage farming operations. Urban planning experts began questioning the wisdom of allowing HOAs to expand into agricultural zones. As the media coverage grew, so did the pressure on local officials to act. The County Board of Supervisors announced a special session to review regulations on HOA expansion and agricultural land protection. State legislators began drafting bills to strengthen protections for heritage agricultural sites. Looking at all the coverage, Emma remarked one evening, maybe this had to happen. Maybe our trees had to fall so people would finally wake up to what we're losing. It was a bittersweet observation, but one that carried a seed of hope. Our personal tragedy was transforming into a catalyst for change. As our legal team dug deeper into Meadowbrook Development Group's activities, the evidence of wrongdoing grew increasingly alarming. Sarah Martinez and her associates had set up a makeshift investigation center in our barn's loft, walls covered, with timelines, photographs, and connection diagrams that looked like something from a detective show. "Look at this," Sarah said one morning, spreading out a new set of documents across the work table. "We've found discrepancies in every single property annexation they've attempted in the last 3 years. It's not just sloppy paperwork, it's a deliberate pattern of deception." Clara Chen had discovered something particularly damning in the county records. They filed their HOA expansion documents using a loophole meant for emergency urban development, she explained, pointing to highlighted sections. But here's the interesting part. They claimed our farm was abandoned agricultural land, despite having active state certifications and regular tax filings as a working farm. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Morrison's team discovered environmental impact reports that had been buried in the county archives. These reports explicitly warned against development in this area, he explained, laying out maps marked with watershed protection zones. The property was designated as crucial for local groundwater recharge. They not only ignored these findings, they actively concealed them. Emma and Anna had been tracking the paper trail of Meadowbrook's various subsidiaries. "It's like a shell game," Emma explained, pointing to her computer screen showing a complex web of company names and dates. "They create new LLCs for each development, then dissolve them as soon as they've acquired the land. Makes it harder to track responsibility and liability." Our anonymous insider, Marcus Reynolds, provided crucial context through encrypted messages. The company's internal motto was "easier to ask forgiveness than permission," he revealed. They calculated that the fines for violations would be less than the profit from development. They saw environmental protection laws as speed bumps, not barriers. The evidence of premeditation was stacking up. Financial records showed that Meadowbrook had been purchasing influencer accounts months before targeting our farm, using them to create artificial social media pressure about eyesore farms near their developments. They had even hired a PR firm to craft narratives about the urbanization necessity of removing agricultural operations from suburban areas. Maria had made a crucial discovery while reviewing delivery records. They deliberately scheduled their action during our peak harvest season, she pointed out. Look at these dates. They coordinated their moves with agricultural calendars, targeting farms when they knew owners would be most distracted and vulnerable. The investigation revealed a sophisticated system of legal manipulation. They would file property claims during holiday weeks when government offices were understaffed, exploit temporary gaps between shifting jurisdictions, and use emergency development clauses to bypass normal review processes. It was legal maneuvering turned into an art form designed to overwhelm small farmers with bureaucratic complexity. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from Sarah Chen's restaurant network. They were approaching local businesses months ago, she revealed, offering them exclusive development opportunities in a new shopping center planned for exactly where our orchard stood. They were selling our property before they even made a move on it. The documentation team found evidence of environmental violations beyond just the destruction of heritage trees. Soil samples from the destroyed area showed that the heavy equipment had compacted the ground to a degree that violated watershed protection standards. The rushed demolition had also released decades-old agricultural chemicals that should have been properly contained and disposed of. Richard Standing Bear's tribal researchers uncovered historical records that further complicated Meadowbrook's claims. This land was part of a historical agricultural corridor, he explained, showing centuries-old maps. There are protected native plant species here that predate current property laws. Their destruction violates multiple federal preservation statutes. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from the HOA's own records. Through careful analysis, our team discovered that Meadowbrook had never actually completed the legal requirements for expanding their jurisdiction. They had simply started acting as if the annexation was approved, counting on their victims' confusion and the complexity of property law to prevent any effective resistance. They created a paper trail that looked legitimate at first glance, Sarah Martinez explained, but it's full of holes when you look closer. Missing signatures, skipped procedures, ignored notifications. They were counting on nobody checking. Too carefully. The scale of deception was staggering. Every new piece of evidence revealed another layer of calculated manipulation. They hadn't just broken the law. They had systematically exploited every loophole and weakness in the system, turning property development into a weapon against agricultural preservation. As we compiled all this evidence, a clear picture emerged of a company that had built its business model on the assumption that small farmers wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. They had counted on isolation and intimidation to achieve their goals, but now, with our growing coalition and mounting evidence, their tactics were being exposed to public scrutiny, and their carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to crumble. The breakthrough in our case came from an unexpected source. Late one evening, as I was closing up the barn, a car pulled into our driveway with its lights off. From it emerged Jennifer Walsh, former executive assistant to Patricia Reynolds, clutching a thick manila envelope to her chest. "I can't stay." "Long," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But you need to see these. I've been keeping copies of everything, just in case something like this happened." Her hands trembled as she handed over the envelope. "They don't know I have." "These?" Inside were hundreds of internal emails, memos, and meeting minutes documenting Meadowbrook's entire operation from the inside. The materials revealed a level of calculation that shocked even our seasoned legal team. Sarah Martinez spent the entire night reviewing the documents, her expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is beyond anything we imagined," she explained the next morning to our core team. They had a dedicated task force for targeting agricultural properties. They called it Operation Harvest. They actually gave it a code name, like some kind of military operation. The documents revealed weekly strategy meetings where they discussed which farms to target. They had detailed profiles of every agricultural property in the region, complete with assessments of each owner's likely ability to resist their tactics. Our farm had been on their radar for over 2 years. "Look at this," Emma said, pointing to an email thread. "They specifically noted our heritage apple varieties as a potential complication, but decided to proceed anyway because, and I quote, historical agricultural designations rarely survive determined legal pressure." Jennifer's documents included minutes from closed-door board meetings where Patricia Reynolds had explicitly discussed their strategy. "Time is on our side," she had said in one meeting. "These small farmers can't afford prolonged legal battles. Push hard enough and they'll give up." The revelations kept coming. There were detailed psychological profiles of various farmers, including me. They had studied our routines, our financial situations, even our family relationships. They had calculated the best times to apply pressure, deliberately timing their actions to coincide with crucial farming periods when we would be most vulnerable. They had moles everywhere, Maria noted, reviewing a list of local contacts. People at the county offices, in local businesses, even in some environmental groups. They were gathering intelligence on us for months before they made their move. One particularly disturbing document outlined their media strategy. They had prepared multiple narratives to justify their actions, including plans to paint farmers as obstacles to progress and environmental hazards. They had even drafted letters to the editor, ready to be sent under various names to create the illusion of public support for their actions. Jennifer herself had been struggling with guilt over her role in the scheme. "I didn't realize how bad it was at first," she explained during a longer meeting with our legal team. "It was all presented as normal business development, but then I started seeing the human cost, watching families lose land that had been theirs for generations." She described weekly meetings where executives would joke about farming the farmers, treating the destruction of family farms as nothing more than a business strategy. They had a countdown calendar, she revealed, her voice shaking. They called it days until harvest, counting down to when they would move on each property. The internal communications revealed that our resistance had caught them off guard. "They're not used to farmers fighting back," Jennifer explained. "Usually the threat of legal costs is enough to force compliance. Your coalition really scared them. They've never faced organized resistance before." Perhaps most damning were the financial projections. Meadowbrook had calculated the potential fines for violating agricultural protection laws and simply factored them into their budget as a cost of doing business. They had even set aside funds for what they called nuisance settlements, money to quiet any farmers who put up too much of a fight. This wasn't just opportunistic development, Sarah Martinez explained as we reviewed the documents. This was a systematic campaign to eliminate agricultural properties from the region. They saw farms as obstacles to be removed, not as valuable parts of the community. The documents proved that Patricia Reynolds had lied under oath during preliminary hearings. She had claimed no knowledge of the agricultural protections on our property, but internal emails showed detailed discussions of how to circumvent these very protections. Jennifer's whistleblowing didn't stop with documents. She offered to testify about conversations she had witnessed, meetings she had attended, and decisions she had seen made. "I know I was part of this," she said quietly. "Now I want to help make it right." The revelation of these internal documents changed everything. What had started as a fight to save our farm had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened agricultural communities across the region. These weren't just papers. They were evidence of a calculated assault on farming heritage, planned and executed with corporate precision. As we organized and catalogued Jennifer's documents, we realized we now had the ammunition needed, not just to fight back, but to expose the entire system that threatened farms like ours. The question now was how to use this information most effectively to protect not just our land, but all agricultural heritage properties facing similar threats. The morning after Jennifer's revelations, Meadowbrook Development Group launched a desperate counterattack. Their lawyers filed an emergency motion with the County Board of Supervisors seeking retroactive approval for their annexation of our property. It was a bold move that caught us off guard, despite our growing experience with their tactics. They're trying to legitimize their actions after the fact, Sarah Martinez explained during an emergency meeting in our barn. If they can get the county to approve the annexation retroactively, it could undermine much of our legal case against them. The timing was deliberate. They filed their motion just before a long weekend, knowing we'd have limited time to respond. Their documentation painted a picture of reasonable development being hindered by agricultural obstruction. They even included computer-generated images showing their vision for our property. A pristine park with walking trails where our orchard had stood, surrounded by high-end homes. Emma discovered their PR campaign first, scrolling through social media. "Look at this," she called out, turning her laptop to show us. "They're running sponsored posts about modernizing outdated agricultural zones and bringing green spaces to the community. They're trying to control the narrative. Their marketing materials conveniently omitted any mention of the heritage, trees they'd destroyed, or the agricultural protections they'd violated. Instead, they presented themselves as visionaries, transforming underutilized agricultural land into community assets." The county board scheduled an emergency hearing for the following Tuesday. We had less than 4 days to prepare our response. Our coalition sprang into action, working around the clock to counter their move. "They're hoping to overwhelm us with paperwork," Dr. Morrison observed as we sorted through their filing. "There are over 1,000 pages here, but most of it is filler, technical specifications for developments that don't even exist yet. They're burying the real issues under bureaucratic noise." Our legal team discovered that Meadowbrook had been laying groundwork for this move for weeks. They had quietly been meeting with certain county officials, presenting their development plans as a solution to the county's housing shortage. They'd even promised significant tax revenue increases if their projects were approved. Richard Standing. Bear's tribal legal team found a crucial weakness in their strategy. Their retroactive approval request completely ignores federal protections for historical agricultural lands, he explained. They can't just erase those protections with a county board vote. But Meadowbrook wasn't relying solely on legal maneuvers. They launched a multi-pronged pressure campaign that targeted everyone involved in our resistance. Local businesses that supported us suddenly found themselves facing mysterious health and safety inspections. Farmers who had joined our coalition received letters threatening legal action over alleged code violations. Sarah Chen reported that restaurants featuring our produce were being approached by Meadowbrook's representatives, offering them exclusive deals to switch suppliers. "They're trying to isolate us," she said. "Cut off our community support one piece at a time." Even our political support came under pressure. County board members who had publicly supported us started receiving calls from powerful development interests. Campaign contributors were subtly reminded about the economic benefits of suburban expansion. Jennifer Walsh, our whistleblower, faced personal attacks. Anonymous posts appeared online questioning her credibility. Her former colleagues suddenly remembered performance issues from her time at Meadowbrook. It was character assassination, corporate style. This is exactly their playbook, Jennifer told us, her voice tight with anger. When they can't win legally, they try to break down resistance through intimidation and isolation. They're hoping we'll give up just to make it stop. But they had underestimated the strength of our coalition. When Meadowbrook's representatives approached local businesses, they found owners ready with lawyers' cards and media contacts. Their intimidation attempts were documented and added to our growing legal file. The farming community responded with unprecedented unity. When Meadowbrook tried to pressure individual farmers, they found themselves facing a united front. Farmers offered each other support, shared resources, and stood together against the pressure. Emma's social media team turned their PR campaign against them. Every sponsored post about modernization was met with real images of destroyed heritage trees and displaced wildlife. Their sanitized vision of suburban paradise was contrasted with the reality of lost agricultural heritage. Dr. Morrison mobilized the scientific community. Leading agricultural researchers submitted statements to the county board about the irreplaceable nature of heritage farming operations. Environmental impact studies demonstrated the crucial role of agricultural lands in maintaining local ecosystems. As the Tuesday hearing approached, we realized that Meadowbrook's desperate move had actually strengthened our position. Their attempt to legitimize their actions had exposed the extent of their influence peddling and pressure tactics. What they had intended as a knockout blow had instead revealed the full scope of their corporate manipulation. They're showing their true colors now, Sarah Martinez observed as we prepared for the hearing. Every pressure tactic, every intimidation attempt, every backroom deal, it all proves that they knew their original actions were illegal. They're trying to change the rules because they know they broke them. As Meadowbrook's desperate counteroffensive unfolded, public pressure against them reached a boiling point. The morning of their retroactive approval hearing, over 500 people gathered outside the county administration building. Farmers had parked their tractors along the street, creating a wall of agricultural equipment that served as a powerful visual reminder of what was at stake. Emma's social media campaign had transformed into a movement. Save Heritage Farms was trending nationally, with supporters sharing stories of their own family farms and agricultural heritage. Celebrity chefs and environmental activists were amplifying our message, turning our local struggle into a national conversation about agricultural preservation. "Look at this," Emma said, showing me her phone during the protest. "People are organizing. Similar movements in other states. Our fight is inspiring others to protect their own agricultural heritage." The hashtag had spawned dozens of local variations as communities across the country began examining their own development pressures. On farmland, Sarah Chen had organized a remarkable display of support from the culinary community. Local restaurants set up food stations around the protest, serving dishes made with heritage produce. "Taste what we're fighting for," read the banners above their tables. The contrast between their fresh, flavorful dishes and Meadowbrook's sterile development plans couldn't have been clearer. Inside the building, our legal team was preparing for the hearing when we received unexpected support. A group of Meadowbrook Estates residents, led by their new HOA board, arrived to testify against the retroactive approval. "We were misled about these development plans," their spokesperson explained to reporters. "We bought homes thinking we were joining a community, not funding a land grab operation." Dr. Morrison had assembled an impressive panel of agricultural experts. They came armed with studies showing the ecological impact of destroying heritage farmland. "These aren't just fields and trees," one expert testified. "They're living laboratories of agricultural history, genetic repositories that could be crucial for future food security." The media presence was overwhelming. News vans lined the street, and reporters conducted interviews with farmers, activists, and supporters. Our story had struck a chord that resonated beyond our local community. It had become a symbol of resistance against unchecked development and the erosion of agricultural heritage. Richard Standing Bear's tribal representatives added a powerful historical perspective. They presented centuries-old maps showing the traditional agricultural significance of the area. This land has been feeding communities since before written records, their speaker testified. Its agricultural value isn't just about current use, it's about maintaining a connection to our shared history. The pressure began affecting Meadowbrook's business relationships. Major investors started questioning their involvement with the company. Environmental groups initiated boycotts of their developments. Even their construction contractors were facing public pressure to stop working on their projects. Jennifer Walsh's whistleblower testimony had opened floodgates. Other former Meadowbrook employees began coming forward with their own stories. Each new revelation added to the picture of a company that had systematically targeted agricultural communities for exploitation. Local officials, feeling the weight of public attention, began distancing themselves from Meadowbrook's plans. Political supporters who had once championed their developments were now calling for investigations into their practices. The company's carefully cultivated network of influence was unraveling in real time. Maria organized a powerful demonstration of community agriculture's impact. She coordinated with local food banks and social service organizations to show how many families relied on produce from small farms like ours. This isn't just about preserving trees, she testified. It's about food security and community resilience. The environmental impact became increasingly clear as more experts weighed in. Soil scientists documented how the destruction of our orchard had damaged local watershed systems. Wildlife experts reported on displaced species and disrupted ecosystems. Each report added to the evidence that Meadowbrook's actions had far-reaching consequences. Anna's college agricultural program organized student demonstrations across multiple campuses. Young people spoke passionately about the importance of preserving agricultural knowledge and heritage varieties. Their involvement brought energy to the movement and highlighted the generational impact of losing family farms. The pressure, even, reached Meadowbrook's corporate headquarters. Shareholders began questioning the company's strategies and liability exposure. Their stock price fluctuated as markets reacted to each new revelation. What had started as a local land dispute was now affecting their entire business model. As public support grew, so did the resources available to our cause. Legal funds were established to help other farmers fight similar battles. Agricultural preservation groups offered technical assistance and documentation support. A network of resistance was forming, built on the foundation of our struggle. The day before the crucial hearing, we received word that several major environmental organizations were filing amicus briefs supporting our position. Their legal teams had reviewed our evidence and concluded that the case could set important precedents for agricultural land protection nationwide. Looking out at the sea of supporters gathered outside the county building, I realized that our fight had grown into something much larger than saving one farm. It had become a line in the sand, a moment when communities decided to stand up against the erosion of their agricultural heritage. The question now was whether this groundswell of support would be enough to stop Meadowbrook's desperate attempt to legitimize their actions. The morning of the county board hearing dawned with an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds. Our barn, which had become the unofficial headquarters of our resistance, was buzzing with activity as final. Preparations were made, legal documents were being organized, presentations finalized, and last-minute strategy sessions conducted in every corner. Sarah Martinez had barely slept, fine-tuning our presentation until the early hours. We need to make this about more than just one farm, she explained, spreading documents across our kitchen table. This hearing isn't just about stopping their retroactive approval. It's about setting a precedent that will protect other farms from similar tactics. Dr. Morrison arrived early with his team of agricultural experts, each carrying thick binders of research and impact studies. We've documented every lost tree, every disrupted ecosystem, every violation of agricultural preservation statutes, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the evidence. They can't deny the scientific reality of what they've destroyed. Emma was coordinating with media teams, ensuring our message would reach beyond the hearing room. We've got live streams set up, social media teams ready, and journalists from major networks covering this, she reported, her laptop showing dozens of open communication channels. Whatever happens today, the whole country will be watching. Jennifer Walsh, our whistleblower, was visibly nervous as she reviewed her testimony. Despite the harassment and threats she'd faced, she stood firm in her decision to expose Meadowbrook's tactics. They thought they could silence me with intimidation, she said, hands shaking slightly as she organized her documents. But some things are more important than career safety. Maria and her family had arrived before sunrise to help prepare. They understood better than most what was at stake. Their own small farm could easily be next if Meadowbrook succeeded today. Ina had brought fellow agriculture students who were setting up displays showing the scientific importance of heritage farming operations. Richard Standing Bear and his tribal representatives arrived wearing traditional ceremonial attire, making a powerful statement about the historical significance of agricultural lands. We're not just fighting for current farms, he explained. We're fighting for centuries of agricultural heritage and the right to preserve traditional farming practices. Sarah Chen had mobilized the local food community one final time. Food trucks and stands lined the streets around the county building, offering free samples of dishes made with heritage produce. We want everyone to literally taste what we're fighting for, she said, arranging displays of heritage apple varieties, some of the last examples of what our orchard had produced. The scene outside the county building was unprecedented. Farmers had parked their equipment in a solid line along the street, creating a wall of agricultural machinery that stretched for blocks. Banners and signs hung from tractors and combines, bearing messages about agricultural preservation and community resistance. Local business owners who had supported our cause had closed their shops for the morning, bringing their employees to join the crowd. The message was clear. This wasn't just about farming. It was about the entire community standing together against corporate overreach. Our coalition members arrived in waves, each group bringing new evidence and support. Environmental scientists carried maps showing watershed impacts. Historical society members brought documents proving the area's long agricultural heritage. Agricultural students arrived with research showing the genetic importance of heritage. Varieties. Inside our makeshift command center, we conducted final reviews of our presentation. Each piece of evidence had been meticulously prepared, each argument carefully crafted. We had assembled a comprehensive case that showed not just the illegal nature of Meadowbrook's actions, but the broader threat their tactics posed to agricultural communities everywhere. The mood was tense but determined. We knew Meadowbrook would bring their top corporate lawyers, would try every trick to legitimize their land grab. But we had something they didn't. The truth, backed by science, history, and community support. David Martinez, the vineyard owner who had successfully fought off a similar attempt, arrived with encouraging news. Other development companies are already backing away from similar projects, he reported. They're watching this case closely. If we win today, it changes everything. As the time for the hearing approached, I took a moment to walk through what remained of our orchard. The morning light filtered through the surviving trees, their branches still heavy with spring blossoms. These trees, some planted by my grandfather, had witnessed generations of agricultural history. They stood as silent witnesses to our fight to preserve not just our farm, but a way of life that was increasingly under threat. Looking back at the gathering crowd, I saw the true strength of our position. We weren't just a family fighting for our farm anymore. We had become the focal point of a movement, a coalition of farmers, environmentalists, scientists, and community members united in the belief that some things were worth protecting no matter the cost. The time had come. As we gathered our materials and prepared to enter the hearing room, Sarah Martinez reminded us of what was really at stake. "Today, we're not just fighting for one farm," she said. "We're fighting for every family farm that faces these threats, for every piece of agricultural heritage that deserves protection, for every community's right to preserve its agricultural roots." The county board hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The board members sat at their elevated desk, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the unprecedented turnout and media presence. Meadowbrook's legal team occupied one side of the room, their expensive suits and confident demeanors a stark contrast to our diverse coalition. Sarah Martinez opened our presentation with a powerful statement that immediately set the tone. "What we're discussing today isn't just about property lines or zoning regulations," she began, her voice steady and clear. "This is about whether we, as a community, will allow corporations to destroy protected agricultural heritage through deception and force." She methodically laid out the evidence of Meadowbrook's illegal actions, starting with the improper annexation attempt. "They didn't just skip steps in the process," she explained, displaying documents on the large screen. "They deliberately circumvented every protection put in place to preserve agricultural land." Dr. Morrison followed with a detailed presentation of the environmental impact. His slides showed before and after satellite images of our orchard, the stark contrast drawing audible gasps from the audience. "These heritage trees weren't just farm products," he explained. "They were living genetic libraries containing traits that could be crucial for future food security." Jennifer Walsh's testimony proved devastating to Meadowbrook's case. She detailed internal meetings where executives had explicitly discussed ways to bypass agricultural protections. "They called it Operation Harvest," she revealed, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger as she spoke. "They treated the destruction of family farms as a game, celebrating each time they forced a farmer to give up." The Meadowbrook lawyers tried to object, claiming her testimony was irrelevant to the retroactive approval request, but Board Chairman Anderson overruled them. "The intent behind these actions is absolutely relevant to whether we should grant retroactive approval," he stated firmly. Emma presented our social media evidence, showing how Meadowbrook had orchestrated a campaign to undermine public support for local farms. They created fake accounts, spread misleading information, and tried to paint farmers as obstacles to progress, she explained, scrolling through screenshot after screenshot of their coordinated attacks. Richard Standing Bear's presentation added historical depth to our case. He showed maps dating back centuries, documenting the continuous agricultural use of the land. "These farms aren't just businesses," he explained. "They're living connections to our region's heritage, preserving agricultural traditions that predate current property laws." Sarah Chen and local restaurant owners testified about the economic impact of losing heritage produce. "These aren't just any apples," she explained, displaying dishes made with our heritage varieties. "These are unique flavors, textures, and cooking properties that can't be replaced by commercial varieties. When we lose these trees, we lose part of our culinary heritage." Meadowbrook's legal team mounted an aggressive defense, arguing that their development plans would create jobs and increase tax revenue. But their arguments felt hollow in the face of our evidence. When they claimed they were modernizing underutilized land, Maria stood up with our farm's financial records, showing years of productive harvests and community contributions. The turning point came when Anna presented her research on the genetic diversity of our heritage apples. Some of these varieties existed nowhere else in the world, she explained, her voice catching as she showed pictures of the destroyed trees. Their loss isn't just about one farm. It's about losing irreplaceable genetic resources that took centuries to develop. Meadowbrook's lawyers tried to paint our resistance as anti-progress, but each argument they made was met with concrete evidence of the value of agricultural preservation. When they claimed their development would create green spaces, we showed how their plans would actually reduce biodiversity. When they talked about community benefits, we demonstrated how many families relied on local farms for fresh produce. David Martinez's testimony about their pattern of targeting farms proved crucial. He presented documentation of similar attempts across 3 counties, showing how they had refined their tactics over time. This isn't development, he concluded. This is a systematic assault on agricultural communities. The board members' expressions changed as our evidence mounted. What had perhaps seemed like a routine zoning dispute at the start had clearly evolved into something much more significant. They asked pointed questions about Meadowbrook's methods, their documentation, their failure to follow proper procedures. Near the end of our presentation, I took the stand to speak about what this fight meant for the future of farming. When my grandfather planted these trees, I said, looking directly at the board members, he wasn't just thinking about the next harvest. He was preserving something for future generations. Every farmer in this room does the same thing. We're not just growing crops, we're maintaining a legacy of agricultural knowledge that becomes more valuable with each passing year. As our presentation concluded, the contrast between the two sides couldn't have been clearer. On one side sat Meadowbrooks, lawyers with their polished arguments about progress and development. On our side stood a community united in defense of its agricultural heritage, backed by science, history, and undeniable evidence of corporate wrongdoing. The hearing reached its pivotal moment when Patricia Reynolds herself was called to testify. She strode to the witness stand with the same air of superiority she'd shown when overseeing the destruction of our orchard. But something was different now. The confidence seemed forced, brittle around the edges. Sarah Martinez began her cross-examination with surgical precision. Ms. Reynolds, you testified earlier that you were unaware of the heritage status of the Thompson farm's apple trees. Is that correct? She asked, her tone deceptively casual as she approached the witness stand. That's correct, Patricia replied, her voice steady but her fingers nervously adjusting her designer jacket. The HOA board was not informed of any special status when we initiated the Community Enhancement Project. Then perhaps you can explain this email, Sarah said, projecting a document onto the large screen. It was an internal message from Patricia to the Meadowbrook board, dated 3 months before the destruction. The subject line read, Heritage Tree Removal Strategy, Time Sensitive. The color drained from Patricia's face as her own words appeared before the packed room. Agricultural heritage designations present a unique challenge, but proper timing and aggressive action can overcome these obstacles. Recommend proceeding. During peak harvest season, when resistance will be minimal, the room erupted in murmurs as Sarah continued. You didn't just know about the heritage status, did you, Ms. Reynolds? You specifically planned to circumvent it. She produced document after document, each revealing a new layer of premeditation. Jennifer Walsh's presence in the room clearly rattled Patricia. As Sarah presented more internal communications, Patricia's composed facade began to crack. She glanced repeatedly at her former assistant, perhaps wondering what other documents had survived her attempts to purge the evidence. Would you care to explain this memo? Sarah asked, displaying another damning piece of evidence. It was a strategic planning document titled Operation Harvest, Phase 1, with Patricia's signature at the bottom. The document detailed plans to systematically target agricultural properties, with our farm specifically highlighted as a prime acquisition target. Patricia's attempt to maintain deniability crumbled as Sarah methodically walked through the evidence. Email chains showed her personally directing the campaign to undermine public support for local farms. Financial records revealed payments to social media influencers to spread anti-farming sentiment. Calendar entries documented meetings with county officials where agricultural protection laws were discussed as obstacles to be managed. The most damaging revelation came when Sarah presented evidence of Patricia's personal financial stake in the development. Hidden behind layers of shell companies was proof that she stood to make millions from the conversion of agricultural land to suburban development. So, Ms. Reynolds, Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the tense silence, when you ordered the destruction of the Thompson orchard, you weren't just acting as an HOA president, were you? You were pursuing personal financial gain through the deliberate destruction of protected agricultural resources. Patricia's response was telling. Instead of answering directly, she looked to her lawyers, who quickly objected on grounds of relevance. But the damage was done. Her silence spoke volumes to everyone in the room. Dr. Morrison was called back to the stand to elaborate on the environmental impact of Patricia's decisions. He presented new data showing how the destruction of our heritage trees had already affected local biodiversity. The removal of these trees didn't just destroy individual plants, he explained. It disrupted entire ecological systems that had developed over generations. The scientific testimony was followed by something unexpected. Several former Meadowbrook employees, inspired by Jennifer's example, had come forward with their own evidence. They described meetings where Patricia had explicitly ordered the destruction of documents related to agricultural protections, instructed staff to backdate permits, and coached employees on how to mislead regulatory officials. One former employee's testimony proved particularly devastating. He had been the project manager for Operation Harvest and had kept detailed records of every meeting, every decision, and every attempt to circumvent agricultural protection laws. His documentation showed that Patricia had not only been aware of the illegal nature of their actions, but had actively worked to conceal them. We were told to target farms during their busiest seasons, he explained. The strategy was to move so quickly that farmers wouldn't have time to organize resistance. Ms. Reynolds specifically said that if we faced any legal challenges, we could tie them up in court until the farmers ran out of money to fight. As the testimony continued, the full scope of Patricia's orchestration became clear. She hadn't just violated agricultural protection laws, she had created an entire system designed to exploit and destroy family farms for corporate profit. Every decision, from the timing of their actions to the manipulation of local regulations, had been carefully planned to maximize the chances of success while minimizing the risk of effective resistance. The hearing room fell silent as the last piece of evidence was presented, a recording from a Meadowbrook board meeting where Patricia could be heard clearly stating, "Once the trees are gone, they can't put them back. We just need to move fast enough that no one can stop us. The fines are just a cost of doing business." After 4 days of intense hearings, the county board called for their final session. The room was even more crowded than before, with tension so thick you could almost touch it. Chairman Anderson called the meeting to order, the sound of his gavel echoing through the hushed chamber. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, he began, his voice grave, "This board has reached a unanimous decision." He paused, looking directly at the Meadowbrook representatives. "Not only are we denying the request for retroactive Approval, but we are referring this entire matter to the State Attorney General's office for criminal investigation. The room erupted in cheers, but Chairman Anderson wasn't finished. Furthermore, we are implementing an immediate emergency moratorium on all development activities affecting designated agricultural heritage properties within the county. This board has seen clear evidence of a systematic attempt to circumvent agricultural protection laws, and we will not allow it to continue. The implications of the ruling were immediate and far-reaching. Meadowbrook's lawyers scrambled to their feet, attempting to object, but the decision was final. The board had not only rejected their attempt to legitimize their actions, but had also set in motion a series of consequences that would reshape local agricultural protection. Sarah Martinez quickly outlined what this meant for us. The denial of retroactive approval means their entire operation was illegal from the start, she explained. This opens the door for not just compensation for damages, but punitive damages as well. More importantly, it establishes a precedent for protecting other agricultural properties. The financial implications for Meadowbrook were staggering. The board's decision triggered clauses in their development contracts and insurance policies. Within hours, their stock price began to plummet as investors realized the extent of their liability. Patricia Reynolds, who had left the hearing room immediately after the ruling, would face personal liability for her role in the scheme. Dr. Morrison was already working with state agricultural officials to document the full scope of the environmental damage. This ruling gives us the authority to implement a comprehensive restoration plan, he explained. We can't bring back the exact trees they destroyed, but we can work to preserve and propagate the remaining heritage varieties. The criminal referral to the State Attorney General's office carried serious weight. Investigators arrived within days to begin collecting evidence. Jennifer Walsh's whistleblower status was officially recognized, protecting her from any retaliation and ensuring her testimony would be central to the criminal case. Emma's social media channels exploded with the news. Justice for Heritage Farms trended nationwide as agricultural communities celebrated the victory. Messages poured in from farmers across the country who had faced similar threats, seeing hope in our success. Sarah Chen organized an impromptu celebration at our farm, bringing together the entire coalition that had supported our fight. Local restaurants served dishes featuring preserved heritage apple varieties, a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost, but also a symbol of what we had managed to save. The ruling had immediate effects beyond our case. Other development companies began withdrawing similar proposals across the state. HOAs that had been considering agricultural land grabs suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. The board's decision had shifted the balance of power back toward agricultural preservation. Richard Standing Bear's tribal council was particularly pleased with the precedent set for protecting historical agricultural lands. This ruling recognizes that agricultural heritage has value beyond simple property rights, he explained. It's a victory for cultural preservation as well as environmental protection. Maria and her family helped organize a community meeting to discuss restoration plans. Local farmers offered grafts from their own heritage trees, while agricultural students volunteered to help with the replanting effort. The destruction had created a wound in our community, but the healing process was already beginning. The financial settlement, when it came, was substantial. Meadowbrook was ordered to pay not only for the physical damage to our property, but also for the loss of irreplaceable agricultural resources. The judge assigned to the civil case took the unprecedented step of requiring them to fund a trust for agricultural preservation in our region. David Martinez's prediction proved accurate. Our case had changed everything. The board's ruling was already being cited in similar cases across the country. Agricultural protection laws that had been treated as mere guidelines were now being enforced with new vigor. Perhaps most significantly, Patricia Reynolds and several other Meadowbrook executives faced criminal charges for their roles in the scheme. The evidence of their deliberate attempt to destroy protected agricultural resources, combined with their efforts to cover up their actions, had crossed the line from civil violations into criminal conduct. The victory felt surreal as we stood in what remained of our orchard that evening. The setting sun cast long shadows through the surviving trees, their branches still heavy with spring blossoms. We had lost something precious, but we had gained something too, a precedent that would help protect other farms from facing the same threat. The months following our victory brought changes that rippled far beyond our farm. Meadowbrook development. Group's downfall became a cautionary tale in corporate boardrooms across the country. Their stock price continued to plummet as more evidence of their illegal practices emerged, eventually leading to the company's dissolution and restructuring under court supervision. The State Attorney General's investigation expanded beyond our case, uncovering a network of similar schemes targeting agricultural properties throughout the region. Patricia Reynolds and several other executives faced multiple criminal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and environmental crimes. The sight of her being led from her office in handcuffs made national news, a powerful symbol of corporate accountability. Our case sparked legislative action at both state and federal levels. The Heritage Agricultural Protection Act was introduced in the state legislature, incorporating many of the lessons learned from our fight. The law strengthened protections for family farms, imposed stricter penalties for violations, and created new oversight mechanisms for development near agricultural lands. Emma's role in documenting our struggle led to the creation of an agricultural preservation network. The digital platform she developed became a model for other farming communities, helping them identify and respond to similar threats. "We're connecting farmers across the country," she explained during a national conference. "No one has to fight these battles alone anymore." Dr. Morrison's work cataloging our heritage varieties gained new significance. Universities and agricultural research centers established a collaborative program to preserve and study heritage crops. Our farm became a living laboratory, hosting researchers and students studying agricultural biodiversity. The remaining sections of our orchard were designated as a protected genetic resource site. The impact on local farming was profound. The Heritage Agricultural Protection Alliance, HOA, we'd formed, grew into a powerful advocacy organization. Maria took a leading role, coordinating with farmers across the state to document and protect their agricultural heritage. The early warning system she'd developed helped several farms identify and stop attempted land grabs before they could progress. Sarah Chen's Restaurant Coalition evolved into a farm-to-table certification program that emphasized heritage crop preservation. Restaurants proudly displayed their support for local farms, and consumers became more aware of the importance of agricultural diversity. The movement sparked a renewed interest in heritage varieties, creating new markets for traditional farming operations. Richard Standing Bear's Tribal Council used our case as a foundation for strengthening protection of traditional agricultural lands. They worked with other tribes to develop comprehensive documentation of historical farming practices, creating an additional layer of legal protection for agricultural heritage sites. The legal precedents established by our case had far-reaching effects. Sarah Martinez found herself in demand nationwide, consulting with other communities facing similar threats. The strategies we'd developed became a blueprint for defending agricultural lands against corporate encroachment. Courts began citing our case in rulings across the country. Jennifer Walsh's whistleblower testimony led to enhanced protection for corporate employees who exposed environmental crimes. The state legislature passed the Agricultural Whistleblower Protection Act, ensuring that others who stood up against corporate wrongdoing would have legal protection. Anna's College established a new program focused on agricultural heritage preservation, combining traditional farming knowledge with modern scientific research. The program attracted students from across the country, creating a new generation of advocates for sustainable agriculture and heritage preservation. Community support for local farms grew stronger. The farmers' market expanded. New CSA programs were established, and schools incorporated agricultural heritage into their curricula. Our barn, once just a storage space, became a community center hosting workshops, classes, and events celebrating farming traditions. David Martinez's prediction about changing development practices proved accurate. Companies began approaching agricultural communities differently, seeking collaboration rather than confrontation. Some developers even incorporated working farms into their plans, creating true agricultural communities rather than trying to eliminate farming operations. The transformation wasn't limited to legal and policy changes. Our story had sparked a cultural shift in how people viewed family farms and agricultural heritage. The public began to understand that farms weren't just food production facilities. They were living archives of agricultural history, crucial repositories of genetic diversity, and essential parts of community identity. Even some former Meadowbrook Estates residents joined the movement for agricultural preservation. The new HOA board worked with us to create educational programs about sustainable agriculture and local food systems. The suburban-rural divide that developers had tried to exploit began to heal as communities found common ground in protecting agricultural heritage. 1 year after our victory, I stood in our restored orchard, watching the spring blossoms open on newly grafted trees. While we couldn't bring back the exact trees we'd lost, we had managed to preserve their legacy. The young saplings grown from cuttings of our surviving heritage trees and donations from other farmers represented a new beginning. The restoration process had been painstaking but rewarding. Dr. Morrison's team had helped us properly document and preserve genetic material from our remaining trees. Agricultural students, under Anna's guidance, had carefully mapped the orchard to ensure optimal conditions for each variety. The new plantings incorporated advanced, sustainable farming practices while honoring traditional methods. Emma's educational programs had transformed our farm into a living classroom. Every week, groups of students, farmers, and researchers visited to learn about agricultural preservation. The barn, once nearly empty, now housed a state-of-the-art agricultural education center, funded partly by the settlement money and partly by community donations. The Heritage Agricultural Protection Alliance, born from our struggle, had grown beyond anything we'd imagined. Maria coordinated with farms across the country, helping them document their agricultural heritage and protect their lands. Our early warning system had already helped prevent several attempted land grabs, earning us recognition from the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation. Sarah Chen's farm-to-table network had expanded to include dozens of restaurants and hundreds of local farms. The annual Heritage Food Festival she organized at our farm drew thousands of visitors, celebrating the unique flavors and cultural significance of heritage crops. Chefs competed to create innovative dishes using traditional varieties, helping ensure these crops remained economically viable. The legal landscape had shifted dramatically. Sarah Martinez's legal precedents were being taught in law schools as examples of environmental protection and agricultural preservation law. The Heritage Agricultural Protection Act had been adopted by several other states, creating a strong legal framework for protecting family farms. Jennifer Walsh's whistleblower testimony had inspired others to speak out against corporate environmental crimes. Richard Standing Bear's vision of preserving agricultural heritage had taken root in unexpected ways. The Tribal Council's documentation of traditional farming practices had become a model for cultural preservation programs nationwide. Their partnership with our farm helped bridge cultural gaps and preserve ancient agricultural knowledge for future generations. Our community had been transformed. The divide between suburban and rural residents that Meadowbrook had tried to exploit had healed. Former HOA members now volunteered at our farm, helping maintain the educational programs and community gardens. Children who once knew nothing about farming now proudly showed their parents the vegetables they'd grown in our community plots. The criminal cases against Patricia Reynolds and other Meadowbrook executives had concluded with guilty verdicts. But more important than their punishment was the message their convictions sent. Agricultural heritage had value worth protecting, and those who tried to destroy it would face consequences. David Martinez's vineyard had become part of a network of heritage farm preserves, each protecting unique varieties and traditional farming practices. Together, we were creating living repositories of agricultural biodiversity, ensuring these irreplaceable resources would be available for future generations. Anna's agricultural research program had expanded beyond our original goals. Students from around the world came to study traditional farming methods and modern preservation techniques. Their work was helping bridge the gap between historical agricultural practices and contemporary food production needs. The most profound changes were personal. Our fight had taught us that preserving agricultural heritage wasn't just about saving trees or protecting property rights. It was about maintaining connections to our history, to our community, to the land itself. Every time I walked through our orchard, I felt those connections growing stronger, watching new families discover the joy of picking fresh heritage apples, seeing children learn about farming in our educational programs, and knowing that our story had helped protect other farms. These were the real victories. The trees we'd lost could never be replaced, but their legacy lived on in the movement they'd inspired. Our farm had become more than just a place to grow food. It was a symbol of resistance against corporate greed, a testament to the power of community action, and a living example of how agricultural heritage could be preserved for future generations. The heritage trees that remained stood as silent, witnesses to our struggle, their branches reaching toward the future while their roots held firm to the past. As I watched the sun set over our restored orchard that evening, I realized that what had started as a fight to save our farm had become something much larger. We had helped spark a movement that was changing how people thought about agricultural heritage, community resistance, and the true value of family farms. Our story had become part of a larger narrative about preserving not just trees and land, but the very roots of our agricultural history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.